So after a hell of a new year, I wanted to start things off this year with something a little bit mellower and altogether more grounded. So here's an 81-minute movie about semi-undead psychic vampires. I actually found out about One Dark Night while listening to a stream about old videotapes. They'd quite recently come across a haul of tapes and were going through them when one of the hosts stopped dead in his tracks and monologued for a good solid minute about just how underrated and brilliant this movie was, how he couldn't recommend it enough, and how upset he was that so few people had actually even heard of it. Naturally, this clearly ticked all the boxes for me, and so I had to investigate. Fortunately, the people at 88 Films very recently released this one on DVD and Blu-ray, and at the time of recording this, the price is very reasonable. So I literally had no reason not to check this one out. One Dark Night is a 1982 horror suspense movie that was directed and written by Tom McLoughlin, who you'll most likely know best for having written Friday the 13th Part 6. Though he's also crossed the floor as well, having directed an episode of Freddy's Nightmares, only to more recently swiftly cross back across the floor, having contributed some of the script elements for the Friday the 13th game. He's more than well versed with the horror genre, and this movie was his first directing credit and only his second ever writing credit. So I was kind of going into this giving the filmmaker a lot of faith. While he would go on to great things, there's no guarantee that his first proper effort would be decent. So what's it all about? Well, One Dark Night is really 2.5 B-plots that run under their own steam until the last 10 or 20 minutes, when they all merge into one A-plot ending. What would be considered the main B-plot follows Julie, a nice girl who's sick of being called nice. She wants to join a sorority house, and the three girls who are in the house are subjecting her to some harsh initiations that her boyfriend Steve strongly disagrees with. Nevertheless, Julie is approached by the sorority girls to undertake a final initiation task in order to grant her full access to the sisterhood. She has to spend a night alone in a mausoleum, and she can't leave until they come back to check on her at sunrise. Naturally, she agrees, and as this is an 80s horror movie starring college students, it'll come as absolutely no surprise to you that the sorority sisters don't want Julie to join their sisterhood, and that they're planning on scaring the living daylights out of her in the mausoleum so she fails her pledge and they don't have to take her on. The other B-plot of this movie follows a woman called Olivia. She's the daughter of a notorious serial killer who's been trying to escape her past, but has inevitably been drawn back to it due to the death of her father under semi-mysterious circumstances. When her and her husband, played quite astoundingly by none other than Adam West, attend the funeral, she's suddenly gripped by some vivid visions, which become clearer a short while later when it's revealed that her father was in fact a master of the psychic arts. In particular, he had the ability to drain the living essence or energy from a victim in order to increase his psychic abilities, and even increase his lifespan. However, the energy he could draw from his victims was entirely dependent on the emotion that the victim was giving off at the time. If they're in a happy place when he absorbs them, he'll take a lot of positive energy. But if there's pain, anger, or fear involved, then the energy absorbed would cause the vampire to become evil, paranoid, or purposefully malicious. This is what happened to Olivia's father, and when Olivia finds out that she herself may also contain the ability to use psychic energy, much to the protest of her husband's wishes, she discovers that her father may not entirely be dead, and that there may be bigger plans at work. The half plot that I mentioned in addition, well, I don't know if there's such a thing as a C-plot, but there are two of those in this movie as well. One follows Steve as he travels around his local town trying to get the sorority sisters to either reject Julie outright or accept her without initiations, a plot that he fails at. And then later in the film he turns up at the mausoleum and helps to save Julie, completely at random. The other mini plot in this film happens about 2/3 of the way in and involves one of the sorority girls having a change of heart about scaring Julie and deciding to split from the sorority group. She then runs into Steve and tells him that Julie's at the mausoleum and that the remaining two sorority sisters plan on scaring her. This then leads to all the characters meeting at the mausoleum for a final climactic final fight to the final death. Now, cards on the table time right off the bat. If you want a fast-paced film, if you want a horror, if you want gore, if you want kills, torture, or any of that kind of stuff, this is not the film for you. This is something quite rare. It's a film that takes elements of older horror cinema and repurposes them for a modern audience. This film isn't about visual horror, it's not intending to make you jump or scream or look away. Well, apart from one bastarding jump scare right at the very end of the film that doesn't need to be there and only succeeded in making me go, oh man, I really wanted to like this one. It's an unsettling movie. It crafts its environment carefully to create a suspenseful and moody little film that's low on actual horrors, but very high on vibe. And I think that's the most crucial thing to say about this film. To me, it's got a great vibe. Whereas films like Ring of Terror, which have very similar plot themes, fell apart because they didn't get the feeling for how a film like this should work, One Dark Night sticks the landing by tightening up the pacing a bit, keeping it campy enough to make it entertaining but serious enough to give it weight and emphasis. It looks nicer, the scripting's sharper, the whole thing just looks and feels great to me. I'm not gonna lie, it's not the best film ever made, but for a first-time writer-director's first attempt at a feature, this is pretty bloody brilliant. I'll get the biggest gripe I had about this film out of the way from the top. The dialogue's a bit stiff. That's not to say the cast can't handle that through their delivery, but there are just some lines that really are clunky to say the least, and there are moments that just feel a bit out of place and weird. I'll also readily admit here that while this film runs at a pretty decent pace, as a lover of tight edits, I think there are just a couple of moments here and there that could have been trimmed down somewhat, or removed altogether. That would have allowed this film to run a lot tighter and generally a lot better. In particular, the second act slows down quite significantly as we enter a bit of a period of time killing. I very nearly ended up clock watching, but rather mercifully, just as my tolerance was about to break, the third act kicked in, and while it was far from perfect, it kept tight enough just long enough to keep me on board. But hey, if the biggest problems I can pick with this film are that the dialogue's a bit lumpy in places and it could have been a bit shorter, then that's hardly anything to be sniffed at, eh? As mentioned, I love the fact that this film puts the onus on horror back into the realms of suspense, tension and atmosphere over jump scares, blood, guts and psychopaths. This is an hour and 20 minutes where no one dies on screen, and the whole thing is just a great way to immerse yourself into this universe's feel and vibe. It was genuinely refreshing, and for that reason alone, I recommend you look this one up. I hadn't seen a film attempt something like this for the best part of 15 years successfully. And come to think of it, I don't think I've seen a film try this again since. And I really don't know why producers and directors don't explore this style more often. Well, I kinda do. It's because gore and extreme images sells more tickets, and making a well-crafted suspense horror is too much of a risk both in terms of time invested and money on the line. There are very few exceptions. What does help bring this film's script to life is some damn fine cinematography. Seriously, some of the compositions in this are absolutely gorgeous considering this film's background and budget. Whether it's some gorgeous panning and sweeping through the mausoleum, or whether it's the explosive finale, there's a great range of shot types and just enough experimentation to keep me from grumbling. While I'd maybe draw the line at comparing it to some of the more well-known, visually striking films out there, again, for its pedigree and background, I'm astounded that the film turned out the way it has. It really does need to be seen to be believed. In a similar vein, the direction's also really quite wonderful. The cast, for the most part, are able to deal with the script's shortcomings, and they seem to understand the tone rather well. Tom's work here as a director is both distinct and interesting, even at this point in his career, and he manages his cast well, and some of the shot setups look and feel really quite impressive for the time. Again, I can only praise this, it's a more than decent attempt. The soundtrack? Well, it's subtle. That's probably the best word for it. It's by no means bad, but it's buried quite deep in the mix of vocal recordings and sound effects, and because of this, there were times where I didn't even realise music was playing in the background for some sequences. It more than works for the tone that the film's working for, but at the same time, I suppose it could be argued that if the soundtrack's so deep in the sound mix that I can only just hear it occasionally, is it that good of an OST to begin with? Also, I need to point out here that there are some moments where they had to ADR several lines of dialogue and change between the on-set audio and the ADR, which is frankly painful. It's one of the sacrifices of low-budget filmmaking, but yeah, some of the dubbing in this is absolutely atrocious. I think the audio probably could have been remixed and remastered a little bit more carefully, in all honesty. But hey, it is what it is, and it's not absolutely appalling, so that's sort of a plus. On a final note, I have to say that while the editing here is a little bit loose, but ultimately fine, one of the things that does bother me that I can't really find a lot of information on is that there are several points in the film where the quality will suddenly drastically drop with no real explanation. Whether this is because the print has been restored using multiple sources, I've only ever seen this happen once before in the director's cut of The Wicker Man, or whether it's the best sourced copy that's been stored in less than satisfactory conditions is anyone's guess. But it's quite noticeable, and in some places it can be quite distracting. One Dark Night was released on VHS in 1982 or 1983, it's not all that clear. And after that release it drifted into relative obscurity until 2017, when 88 Films brought it back to life with a DVD and Blu-ray release. They've done the best they can with the elements available, and it looks probably about as good as I could imagine it looking, in fairness. There's some pretty nice extras on board, but it is maybe a little bit light on the ground. That being said, I picked this up on eBay for under $5, so I'm not really complaining. It's more than made itself worth the cost of admission here. While watching this movie, one of the main thoughts that ran through my mind was that this would have made a great B-movie partner to a film like Lifeforce or Night of the Comet. It's slow burning and atmospheric, and while the payoff isn't necessarily as good as it could be, the journey itself is a hell of a ride that had set the audience up for something good and solid in the same ilk. On its own merit, this film's quite a gem. It has a good, solid set of Cine and direction, a cast who seem to be having fun making it, and a subdued soundtrack that does the job. While there are pacing and dialogue issues, the actual plot and scripting on a wider scale are really solid and damn good fun. While I'd be crazy to say that this is essential viewing, I can definitely say that if you've explored all your usual horror avenues and you're looking for something fresh and a bit different, give this one a go. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.